Yes.
Good morning, all. We are in the special edition of CSRio. This time, special guest, Professor Andrew Balmford is going to give a speech on feeding the world without costing the earth and 5 uncomfortable observations for conservationists. Professor Andrew is also is a professional of conservation science in the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge. He's also the author of the book Wild Hope, which inspired the TV series of the same title. The series has engaged audiences with positive stories about protecting our planet from biodiversity loss and climate change. And we are in Rio right now. Professor Andrew is visiting us and will stay until May here. So if everyone wants to arrange a call or join online, it's available until May, right? So,
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. I'm afraid I'm going to speak in English because my Portuguese is dreadful. Well, actually, it doesn't really exist. But thank you for bearing with me. Great. Everyone can see this, yeah. Great. So I'm going to spend about 45 minutes, something like that, running through some work which we've been doing over about 25 years. In my group in Cambridge, work with partners all around the world. These people do all sorts of different things. They're not just biologists, lots of different disciplines, lots of different countries. Aga is here on this list, but so too a colleague of mine, Reece Green, who formulated most of the thinking that's going on. He's a long-term conservation scientist. And then Ben Fallon, who some of you may know, who worked at IAS for a long time, was our student, but also a very good friend, and did a lot of this work. So I'm going to examine how we might meet humanity's needs at least cost to other species, and to some extent to the climate. I'm going to focus on farming, and the reason why I'm going to do that will become obvious in a minute. I can use that. I'm going to focus on farming, but I think what I'm talking about is relevant to other contexts in which people compete with nature for access to space. So I think lots of the thinking has parallels that might be of interest in terms of obtaining enough fibre from timber that we want, fish, even space for buildings or for recreation. I'm going to start with why there's a problem, and you'll see why I'm focusing on agriculture straight away when doing that. And then I'm going to try to think about possible solutions. I'll look at the demand side, and I'll particularly look at the supply side. And along the way, I'm going to make what I think of as 5 uncomfortable observations for us. Things we wish maybe weren't true, but and I'm going to jump straight in, and I'm going to ask, how is biodiversity doing globally? The first thing I'm going to show you, so this is data from something called the Biodiversity Intact Index. Many of you will have come across it. It has a high profile in global policy. It looks at the relative abundance of thousands of species in the literature, which are intact and converted natural habitats. And based on that, 58 species, masses of data. The answer they get is the global mean abundance of things relative to in the past is nearly 80%. Now I look at this number, I think that's fantastic. We've got 8 billion people on the planet. They're more or less well fed, not all, but more or less. And we've only removed about 20% of biodiversity. That's a great deal. I think that number's wrong. I think it's dangerously wrong. We could explore why in questions. But just to show you, I'm going to show you why I think it's wrong by comparing it with some other measures that are out there. This is another one which you'll be familiar with, the Living Planet Index, also high profile. This tracks 32,000 vertebrate populations that have been looked at repeatedly and looks at the average change in those. This says that since 1970, on average, there has been a nearly 70% decline. So this is only a 20% since people got started. This is saying 70% decline in just 50 years. I'm going to introduce just a very simple exercise we've done of our own to look at this question. And it draws on, so it's very simple, but you can apply it to lots of different species. It draws on IUCN's data on where species occur in the world and what their habitat preferences are. So here's a hypothetical species, and this is its overall global range, according to IUCN, and there's two made-up habitats, a blue and a green one up there. As species, we know from what IUCN tells us about its habitat preferences, it prefers green habitats, doesn't like the red ones, it doesn't like the blue ones. So it lived, before people came along, in 10 units of land. That was its area of habitat. We now know that we've come along and we've changed some of those habitats to grey habitats. This particular species doesn't like grey habitats. So we can say that it's now gone down to an area of habitat of 8 units. So it's lost its habitat, and the ratio of its current to its original habitat, if you like, is 0.8. Well, my very clever colleague, Alison Ayres, has done this exercise in the real world for nearly 30,000 terrestrial vertebrates. And she's done it at 100-meter resolution for the entire planet. So what do we know about their habitat? How much have they lost compared with what we think of as their pre-human distribution? And this is the result that she gets. And what she finds is that 1 in 7 species have a bigger area of habitat now than they did before people came along. We've given them some new habitat that they like. And that's great. They're doing better. They're winners, if you like. But most species have declined, and some of them have declined very sharply. From this, we can work out some averages. If you take the geometric mean, because it's a skewed distribution across all species, that's at 0.8, quite close to the biodiversity compactness index value. They've got 80%. But it's highly skewed by a few species here doing fantastically well. So if you take those winners out and you look just at the losers, you end up with a geometric mean value of 0.6, roughly speaking. So that's saying, just looking at habitat, and just looking very crudely at that, what its quality or edge effects, fragmentation, and certainly not looking at other things like invasive species or over-harvesting, on average, we're down to 60% biodiversity compared with what we were before. And we think that's a very conservative estimate. Just to give you a couple of other points, to reflect a couple of other studies showing that this kind of number is probably on the high side. It's lower than that in reality. This is a study of the extent of biomes. On average, less than 50% of all the world's biomes are left in low impact areas. That's particularly the case for those which are most species rich. And then, this will be familiar to many of you, this is a summary of where we are with the global red lists. These are the taxa that have been evaluated comprehensively, all of them have been evaluated. And based on that, 30 to 40% of all of those taxa are so reduced that they're assessed as being in danger of extinction. So all of those things, I would argue, suggest that the biodiversity intact number that I started out with is wrong and way wrong. We've lost at least half of everything that there was before people came along. And we know that things are getting worse, and getting worse very quickly. So this is my first uncomfortable but familiar observation for us, which is that biodiversity really is in trouble. Things are getting bad, and they're getting bad quite quickly. But as Fernando said, I don't like to think just about bad news. I think it's really important. We have to do something, be motivated by it, but we have to do things. So I'm going to try to talk about what we can do to try to address this crisis, this extinction crisis. And what might we focus on? Well, BirdLife International is 23 assessment of what's threatening the world's birds. Well-known group, seems like a good place to start. This looks at the different sectors, how they're impacting 1,400 globally threatened bird species. And when they do that, 3/4 of all of those species have as one of their main threats agriculture. That's more than any other sector. It's more than climate change, it's more than invasive species, it's more than overharvesting. All those other things are important, but this is the really, really big one. Not only that, but we know that climate change is responsible for, agriculture is responsible for around 30 to 40% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for unsustainable levels of fresh water use, pesticide applications, and so on. It's a big problem. We can't get away from the issue of farming. And impacts from farming are going to get much, much greater in the next 50 years as our population grows and as we become wealthier. Here's some very nice evidence from David Tillman's group, where they looked based on current trajectories through to 2060, in this case, of what's happening to human population sizes, to our wealth, and therefore what we want to eat, and also to yields, how much production we get per unit area of farmland, so yield. What's happening to all those things? They said, what's going to happen to cropland if we don't do something between now and 2060? This is their projection. Yield of cropland area relative to now is going to grow everywhere, so we're above 1 almost everywhere in the world. But look at what's going to happen in Africa. In Africa, everywhere is going to see dramatic increases in demand for cropland. There are 13 countries on this map. So by 2060, so just 25 years' time, are going to need 4 times or more cropland than they've got now. That's impossible. They can't do that. And as far as they do, the destruction of natural habitats will be catastrophic. Here's a little bit of evidence unpacking that a bit more. They then took this and said, well, what does that mean? And they looked at mammals in this case. They divided it into big, small, large, so large, medium, small, that doesn't matter. Divided it up by major tropical continental areas. And just focus in particular on sub-Saharan Africa. The solid bars are where we are at the moment. They project that if this happens, this is what will happen to the global threats to the world's mammals. Africa, which currently is, relatively speaking, slightly less bad than elsewhere in the world, is going to become a hotspot for global extinctions. This is what's going to happen unless things change. These analyses, and lots of others like that, you'll know of them as well, lead me to the second uncomfortable observation that I want to make, and that is that while other drivers of biodiversity's decline, like climate change, like invasive species, like pollution, they're important, and they get lots of attention. We hear about them all the time in the media. They're sexy, they're, whoa, look at this is really important. They are important. But the greatest source of threat to the world's biodiversity is, and for the most part of this century at least, will remain the very simple, mundane, boring challenge of how we're going to keep people fed. That's going to be the biggest issue. A colleague of mine in the UK called Charles Godfrey said, I think this is, every time I think about this, I think it's a very important observation. He just said, if we fail on food, we fail on everything. I think that's really important. So, what can we do to prevent failure? Well, I'm going to think a little bit on the demand side first of all. I'm going to think about different types of food and how we can try to perhaps reduce demands for higher footprint food. As we all know, food varies widely in its footprint for biodiversity and for other things. Most meat, particularly ruminant meat, is especially damaging. So I'm going to show you just a few results from a student of mine, Emma Garnett, who worked in a very strange context in the UK, which is not politically representative, and among that in Cambridge University, trying to look at how you might shift the behaviour of students, the choices that students make over what meals they eat. I realise this is it's a particular place in the world. There are parts of the world where meat consumption needs to increase, not decrease. But it's interesting nonetheless. She conducted big experiments in Cambridge College cafeterias, tens of thousands of meal choices. What she found was that changing prices had very little effect. Making vegetarian food a bit cheaper didn't seem to change students' choices very much. The common one you see in nudging experiments, which is you have a buffet like this and you just move the vegetarian option closer, you bring it here and move the meat one further away. That worked a little bit, but it wasn't a very strong effect, and it didn't work if the buffet was short. So there's an order effect, but not if the buffet is short. So that's sort of inconsistent. This is the most interesting thing she found. What she was able to do is look at what happens if instead you've got 4 meal choices, usually in one of these buffets. Usually one of them is vegetarian or vegan, the rest are different animal-based things. What happens if you double the relative availability of those plant-based options from 1 in 4 to 2 in 4? And she did this both observationally and in a huge experiment involving almost 100,000 choices by people. And what she found across different parts of the universe, different contexts, she found that if you double the availability of vegetarian meals from 1 in 4 to 2 in 4, you get an increase in sales of vegetarian meals as opposed to meat meals by between 40 and 80%. This is very simple. Meat's still there, you can still buy it, so no one's had their choice deprived. You're just changing the relative availability of what's there. Not only that, but because of the context, we knew what every one of these diners had eaten for the past year before we did this survey, because it's all on their cards. And what we were able to find from that was we were able to classify people as being more or less vegetarian before the study started. We found that this effect was steepest, the response curve was steepest, those people who before the study ate the most meat, they were the least vegetarian. So it has the greatest effect on that section of the population that would be most wanting to have an impact. Didn't change sales, and profits, in fact, went up. So it's quite an interesting observation. There are lots of other things that one could do. There's some evidence that changing advertising can work. Like many of you, I probably think, oh, I'm not much affected by advertising. This is an amazing piece of work. The London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, is very innovative. And a few years ago, he introduced a ban on advertising on the London Underground, on the tube and on the buses, banning this isn't to do with meat, it's to do with high-fat, salt and sugar food, so unhealthy food. He introduced that ban for 1 month. This colleague of mine, Amy Yao, was able to, through another survey, they track what a sample of Londoners brings into their home when they go shopping, all of the food that they buy. And she found that this ban in one place for 1 month reduced, I've got to get the numbers right, reduced by 7% the average calorie purchased by a household in London. There's nothing else you could imagine doing that would cut people's household calorie intake by 7% overnight. A ban worked. And this year, the city of Haarlem in the Netherlands is introducing a ban on public advertising of meat. So you won't be able to. So I want to know what that's going to do. I've got no idea, but it's quite interesting. Okay, so that's trying to reduce demand for higher footprint foods. Another demand/supply side intervention is doing something about food loss and waste. So technically, food loss is what happens upstream of retail. Food waste is what happens downstream of retail. Different processes responsible for it, and in different contexts, different parts of the world. But between them, around a third, maybe a bit more, of all food that's grown in the field never gets into someone's mouth. For all of those, for all sorts of different reasons, and that's obviously crazy. What can we do about it? Well, again, probably need to do different things in different socioeconomic contexts. The science around what works here is patchy. There's more of it in the UK and the US. There's not very much of it in much of the rest of the world. But there are some really interesting observations I just want to mention. There are some interesting ideas about what might work. This was a study done in the States in an all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. So people come along, fill up their plates, and what they found was that people who take a smaller plate end up reducing their consumption, what they put in their mouth, by 31%. And in the States, that's a very good idea. But they also reduce their waste by nearly 60%. Really dramatic, just giving people smaller plates. Giving people china plates instead of paper plates cuts waste. Taking away a tray, so you actually have to carry all that food you've lumped onto your plate properly, that cuts down on waste too. So lots of different things that you can do. There are other things that are not as well tested as that, people putting cameras in fridges and giving people apps. There's all sorts of different things, but the data is a bit patchy. But there is some good news here. This is data for the UK. Usually the UK, I don't think it does very well environmentally, if I'm honest. But it turns out to be a big campaign over the last 15 years by an organisation called RAP. And they estimate that post-farm waste upstream of that, declined in part because of their campaigning work, and also work involving the supermarkets. That's fallen by 27% over an 11-year period. This is the only sustainable development goal the UK is on track to meet, apparently. But there is what. So what's going right here, and what can we learn from that? And I think there's some interesting possibilities out there. So there are things we can do with demand, and there are things that we can do with waste, and they'll be different in different places, and there's lots of work to be done. But analysis by lots of different people suggests that all of those things are going to be essential, but they will not be anywhere near enough. We need to do much more on the production side as well. And here it's really about yields. So this is some work by a friend of mine called David Williams. And he found that although we can do those things with diet and with waste, we're going to also have to dramatically increase farm yields as well. We're not going to get the changes we need in habitat loss without that. So this is some modelling work they did. This, similar to the Tillman study, looks at changes in habitat area for vertebrates between 2010 and 2050. This is again based on business as usual projections. They then they did a whole series of scenarios where they tried to change those business as usual projections, saw what had an effect. They found that land use planning, so being smarter about where you do and don't allow farming, that has some effect, but it's really quite weak. Halving food waste, very ambitious thing to do, might be possible, has an impact in some places, but not a great deal. We need to do it, but it's not going to really shift the diet. Healthier diets can be helpful, particularly here in Latin America, North America, as well, where people eat a lot of meat, animal-based products. But then critically, at the bottom here, you'll see the biggest and most consistent effects come from addressing yields, from boosting how much food we produce per unit area of farmland by narrowing yield gaps. So that's the gap between what we currently produce on average and what's possible, but also raising what's possible. And they found that those things are by far the most important thing to do. That finding has been repeated in lots of other studies around the world, and it leads to my third, I think, very uncomfortable observation for a lot of people, a lot of environmentalists, which is to say that, yes, diet is important, that can help. Waste is important, we have to do things there, and that can help as well. But those are not going to be enough. We are not producing enough food, and we will not produce enough food for 11 billion people unless we also get very serious about food yields. And that means what happens within the field. So I'm going to unpack in this next section why I think high-yield farming is so important. And I'm going to start that by comparing two very different supply-side approaches to producing food and to addressing the environmental impacts of farming. The first of those is the notion of land sharing, sometimes called wildlife-friendly farming. You might see it in the literature. This is an idea that really arose in Europe and North America in response to the observation, which is unequivocal, that industrial farming is bad for biodiversity on the farm. We know that. If you produce food in the way that, in a high-intensity way, biodiversity is in trouble. In response to that, under land sharing, farmers very often get subsidies to do things to try and restore or retain wildlife on farmland. They may cut down the use of chemicals, they may reinstate hedges, ponds, and so on. So you have a shared landscape. And it's an approach that's extremely popular politically. It's worth tens of billions of dollars a year in subsidies in Europe and North America and increasingly elsewhere. But it has a problem. And the problem is that it lowers yields, how much food you get out from a unit area. And we know that's the case because otherwise we wouldn't have to pay farmers to do it. If farmers could get the same out of their farm with less input, then they'd be doing it anyway. We wouldn't have to bribe them, but we pay them because it hits their bottom line, because they get less food out. And that means that if you have to produce the same amount of food, for a given amount of food production, the food demand that Brazil has, if you're going to land share, you're going to have a large area under farming. That means there's less space for everything else, including natural habitats. So there's a trade-off here, an inescapable trade-off. There's no way out of that trade-off. That thinking, so just to say, this is, I'll come back to this. This is then a schematic. This is what a landscape might look like under extreme sharing. So we take sharing to its fullest extreme. So what we want is biodiversity and farming everywhere. Then you farm the entire area that just meets the entire region at a yield, which is a yield scale that just meets your demand. Okay. So an alternative to land sharing, in light of the problem around the yield trade-off, is the idea of land sparing. Under land sparing, the notion is that instead, we increase yields on the land we've already farmed. We get as much out of it as we possibly can. So we meet our demand on a smaller footprint of farmland. And as a result, we've got more space either to leave natural habitats undisturbed or to restore them in some cases. So we have two rather different things, a farmed area and a natural habitat area. And by increasing the yields on this as much as possible, going from that mid-pink right away up to this high-yielding dark pink, we end up being able to spare or restore some area for natural habitat in our landscape. Here there's a caveat as well, in fact, two caveats. In order to deliver sparing, we have to have sustainable ways of increasing yields. That's really important. Sustainable for people, sustainable for the environment. And we have to have a means for ensuring that this farming doesn't just keep on creeping in. We have to somehow have a way of safeguarding that natural habitat. And I'll come back to both of those caveats later on. How are we going to decide which of those alternatives, or anything in between them, is least bad? Well, we spent a long time worrying about how you do these measures, how you begin to answer that question. And we thought that there were three things that are really important here. First of all, you need to be able to look at how species respond to those different farming regimes in the right way. And for us, that means you need to look at the abundance of individual species, and you need to do it for lots of different species. Really important that you look at abundance, not richness. If you go out and count the number of species in a place, that tells you nothing about whether you've lost the rare species and widespread common species have come in from elsewhere, so richness masks that. It doesn't tell you about how viable those species are either. What you need to know is their population sizes. Problem is that's a complete pain. You can't just go and, I've seen one of those, you've got to count them all again and again to have an idea of population. People don't do it. We argue you have to do that. Second, you need to look at all possible land uses. You have to have your farmed habitat, if there's some lightly farmed, some really intensively farmed. You also have to have some baseline habitat. Otherwise you don't know what you're talking about. You need to have some places which have got intact forest. Or you have to go somewhere else where you can imagine what your intact forest would be like if you restored it. So you've got to look at all sorts of land uses. And critically, you have to look at this question of yield. You have to know how much food is being produced in a place, because then you can compare scenarios, different ways of managing your landscape, all of which produce the same amount of food. If you don't match for yield, if you don't measure yield, you can't do that. So that's all really difficult. So we got this great student, Ben Fallon, who some of you know, to do this. It was the worst PhD I've ever supervised. It was the most demanding, extremely difficult. It took him many, many years, but he did brilliantly. And so to have lots of other people. And essentially what they did was just to go back a step, in terms of what calculation will be, this then is all the alternatives we might want to compare, again in a schematic. So we've got extreme land sharing over on the left, everything's being farmed just at that yield, still meets the same amount of food. Extreme land sparing over on the right, very high intensity farming, the largest area under natural habitats, and we can imagine anything in between. And the key is that every one of those slices, each one of those alternative scenarios for our landscape, is producing the same total amount of food. So the system is, if you like, self-contained to a consistent degree. There's no off-site consequences of farming. They're all producing the same thing. We're comparing like with like. So what we said to Ben is, right, this is the framework, go and do it. What he had to go and do was go and measure, this is an imaginary species here, right? Measure how its population density, again, abundance, how that changes as you move from low-yielding, intact natural habitat, zero-yielding here, through a bit of light-yielding farmland, through to the most intensively farmed land you can have in your region. See how that population density changes, and then repeat. And do that for hundreds of species. Do that for every species in your landscape. That means you've got to do all that counting, you've got to go and talk to farmers, you've got to do all the maths. It's complete pain. Anyway, if you can do that, though, you can then work out what each of those slices would deliver for all the species you've got in. These things we call density yield curves. These are all made up, hypothetical. These species are winner species. Their density is just going up the more we're doing in a place. They're great, because we don't need to worry about them. Whatever we do, they're fine. What really matters is these species over here, the loser species. And it turns out when you do the maths, which of these things is least bad for them depends critically on the shape of this curve. If they have this shape curve, then they're okay in lightly yielding farmland. They don't mind it. In that case, they prefer sharing. And then if you've got this shape curve, they fall apart. They absolutely depend on natural habitat. So they do least badly under a spared landscape. So if you can measure these curves for hundreds of species, you can begin to say which of these slices would be least bad for biodiversity. That's what Ben did. We've had 8 other students doing this. And this is the result. So this figure represents 50 person years of work, and mostly not by me. So I'm very proud of the people that did this. These show results for different parts of the world, including the campus here. This is Ben's work in Ghana. And what they found was extraordinary. We were really surprised. They got the same result everywhere in the world, and for every single group of species that we looked at. This is based on this is a summary of all results across 2,000 species, which they've looked at one by one across this gradient, measured that curve, done the calculations. And what they found is that in every place and in every taxon, most species are losers, so they're going to do badly on farming, like we've said. And of the losers, most of them have that shape curve. So not every species, but the majority of species in every group will do least badly. Farming will damage that species the least if we go down a route of land sparing. High yield farming in as little an area as we possibly can manage, sustainably done, but then using that to set aside, to limit our incursion into natural habitats. That's the broad result. Varies a little bit between places, varies a little bit between taxa. Most prominent for those species have got narrow global ranges. Those are the species that are most sensitive to what we do, and of course they're the species that, as conservationists, we're most concerned about. They're the things we're going to lose. So I've never seen a result that's been that consistent before. Every study would come in with the same findings, and was very struck by that. That's biodiversity. So I've looked at the trade-off between biodiversity and food production, but we can use exactly the same modelling approach to look at any other outcome that we care about. This is just one example of that. This is carbon storage. This is above-ground carbon storage on the landscape, work done by David Williams again. What he found is when he goes and measures above-ground carbon on the landscape, then he finds that it follows the same density yield curve. As density of farmland goes up, the carbon disappears, and it disappears very quickly. What that means is that whether it's in forest in Ghana, woodland in Mexico, wetlands in Poland, again, if we're serious about keeping carbon on the landscape, the least bad way of doing that whilst meeting our food demand will be to farm the land that we need as intensively as possible, but safeguard, restore, set aside natural habitats. So I just said that's a consistent result. We found it everywhere we've looked. Other teams that have looked at population sizes get the same result. But there's hundreds of papers out there that tell you that sharing is the thing to do instead of sparing. Why is that the case? I'd argue, and I've looked at all of those papers as far as I know, all of them fail to do at least one of these things. They look at species richness, because that's quick. They very rarely look at abundance. They don't look at baseline habitats, because they don't think about baseline habitats, they think about farms. Or they don't measure anything. So they never manage to build scenarios which are matched in terms of total production. If you don't match in terms of total production, then one of your scenarios, which is very nice locally, we're producing less food than another one. That food's going to come from somewhere. And you've got to keep track of the impact of that, otherwise it's an unfair comparison. So that's what we've concluded from that. And that importance of yield, so as I said, we've got to measure yields to get sensible answers. And foregone production from low yield farming, so you've got low yield farming here, which is very benign. You're not producing some food here that you otherwise could. That production is going to go somewhere else. That foregone production really matters biologically. Crucially, it matters in terms of people as well. And here's a very sobering example, which I came across, which was that in Sri Lanka in 2021, the government decided, for ideological reasons, to force the country to become organic. They banned all imports of fertilizers and pesticides, and the Sri Lankan economy fell apart. So Sri Lanka's been a food producer, net food exporter for decades. It suddenly didn't have enough food. It had to import food. It relies on agricultural exports, tea, spices. Could no longer do that, so couldn't afford to pay to import food. Farmers went bust, people starved, the country went bankrupt, and the government was overturned within a few weeks. So that's what happens if we go hard on into a land sharing approach, empirical evidence of that. We're doing exactly that now in Europe. You'll be pleased to know the European Union's decided it's going to have 30% organic within by 2030, I think. And I think that will be a disaster. This is why. So here we've got the UK, if you like. We've got not very much natural habitat. We've got which of these white blocks. We've got quite high yielding farmland. So the colours have come out a bit strange. But we're somewhere like here on yields. Our farm and birds are doing very badly. People talk about that, producing quite a lot of food. Faced with that, the policy debate in the UK and in parts of Europe said we should go for more sharing, we should have more organic, we should have more hedgerows and so on. We'll reduce our yields, so we'll move down here on this spectrum. There'll be more space for some small bits of natural habitat, more hedgerows and so on. So our farm and birds will go up. That all looks very good. The problem is that we'll produce less food. And that's really, really important because we know that we already in the UK import about half of all of our food, net of exports. We know that roughly speaking, the impact of that on imported food per tonne on biodiversity, it's around 10 times the impact of the food we grow at home. For a whole load of different reasons, but it's about 10 times more impact. So if we increase imports, we may have some more stuff happening locally, but the anteater and the rainforest get it. It's the problem. So that's why that's so. And so this is my fourth penultimate kind of uncomfortable observation, which is that where we have a locally benign intervention for wildlife, which can be organic farming, it can be some other land sharing intervention, it can even be creating a nature reserve. If it's in a place where we used to be getting quite a lot of production, that will have some off-site consequence, because that production is no longer being achieved there. So unless we're simultaneously reducing demand in some way, which we never are, unless we're doing that, then we're going to shift production somewhere else. And that other production somewhere else will have a cost. And that cost may exceed the local benefit. So if ever we think about conservation intervention, safeguarding a forest, making a farm nicer for wildlife, whatever it is, we have to think, is there some production that was going to happen here? And is that going to go somewhere else? And have I accounted for it? Because if I haven't, I'm probably going to overestimate the benefit of a potentially very dangerous policy. That's my penultimate point. What I want to do now is come back to those two problems that I mentioned at the start, earlier on, about how to deliver high yield farming. And first of all, the observation that what we're going to need is sustained and sustainable yield growth. We're going to have to find ways of producing food that we want in a way that's low impact and potentially as low impact as possible and potentially long run. So we have to increase yields. And the reality is that's not going to be easy. These are FAO data. You can see that in certain regions, with some really important commodities, yields are slowing down. So it's not going to be easy to achieve this. And we're certainly not saying that high yield business as usual farming is the way to go. There are certain forms of industrial farming which are really, really bad. They're bad for people, they're bad for the environment, and we shouldn't be sanctioning those. But I think we have to be keeping our eye on the prize here, which is high yield farming. We have to think of new ways, imaginative ways of achieving that. So how can we do that? I don't have a silver bullet, I wish I did, but I would say that what we need to do is look at all sorts of different options and then evaluate them robustly. So just to give you some ideas, obviously there's conventional breeding, which is still going on, producing lots of new varieties. There's new genetic techniques, genetic modification, gene editing. I very strongly believe we cannot reject these because of some ideology. We have to evaluate them on their performance, not on some philosophy that says they're immoral. Other things are not about creating new varieties, they're about doing what we've got, doing things with what we've got already that are smarter. So obviously silvopastoralism is potentially very promising here. This is something that goes on, that was invented about 2 decades ago by Kenyan and UK farmers, researchers, who are concerned about maize and it's being attacked by a moth that causes the maize to fall over. They invented this thing called push-pull, which is a kind of playing with chemistry, but without any external chemicals. So what they did was they have a push crop, which they grow in amongst the maize. This is something moths hate. They really don't like the smell of it. So they fly off. Meanwhile, you have a pull crop, which is the thing that the moths find most exciting in the whole world, and you grow that as a sacrificial hedge around the outside. So moths are pushed out of the crop, pulled towards the hedge. Maize yields in this part of the world have gone up. This is around the Great Lakes region in Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda. They've doubled and tripled as a consequence of this. And there's no external chemistry, there's no pesticides, there's nothing. It's just working with what the farmers have got. So I think that's really quite exciting. There's obviously lots and lots of other things we can think about here. There's exciting co-culture systems between rice and fish. There's conservation agriculture in some of its guises. I think it's precision farming. Just want to give you a couple of bits of evidence that this can really work, and sometimes to a surprising degree. This is in China, one of the most high-yielding parts of the world. Already that gap between what we achieve and what could be theoretically possible is quite narrow, the yield gap. And yet, this is the result of an extraordinary experiment. The biggest experiment I've ever heard of. This was work involved 21 million Chinese farmers with hundreds of thousands of extension officers. And the hypothesis was, don't just go on a statewide prescription for when to put on your water, when to put on your fertilizer. We'll work with you and work out exactly when, given exactly where you are, when you should do those things. So it's about smart application of inputs rather than blanket prescriptions. This is what they managed to achieve, I think it was in 10 years, in terms of maize yield in this case, but the same for rice, the same for wheat, and in terms of inputs. I haven't got the numbers somewhere. I think there was something like a 10% on average increase in yield, one of the most highest yielding parts of the world already, and something like a 10% reduction in inputs. That's roughly what that, and it's the same for different crops in different parts of the world. Inputs really matter, and support for inputs really matters. This shows what's happened to those African countries that have received no assistance over the past 2 decades with seeds and with fertilizers. And these are the countries which get help. You can see that actually, if you give farmers the help that they need, in this case with seeds and fertilizers, they can do extraordinary things. So to conclude this thing about what sustainable farming looks like, to me, it can be any of these. I don't care. I don't care what it looks like. I just care what it does. And for me, that's yield, because that's what makes space on the landscape for carbon, for biodiversity, for other things. And externalities, other costs measured per ton of production. I'm just going to show you a little tiny bit on that. So what have we think about measuring externalities? I think what you can do is, these are different ways of hypothetical ways of producing a ton of food in a given place. All different ways of doing it. We've got the highest yielding ones over here, so they've got the lowest land cost to produce a ton of food. These are then the lowest yielding ones over here. They take more land to produce a ton of food. Then we measure other things we might care about, like water use, pesticide runoff, or whatever. We again measure that per ton. Now, based on what's commonly assumed, one might think that we get trade-offs here. That if we want highly efficient milk production, for instance, that's going to come at a high cost in terms of soils. So we've got a trade-off. In fact, when we went and looked at this with a load of experts from lots of different sectors, and what does this look like really for your wheat or your beef or your dairy? They said, well, we don't really know, but we'll go and look. And they looked in the literature. We found some studies, but there are very few studies that enable you to do this kind of analysis. When we did find them, they were really surprising. So this is work that Aga was involved with. This is Brazilian beef, different Brazilian beef systems. And we're measuring the land cost here. These are the efficient systems, and the greenhouse gas costs. And the greenhouse gas costs of producing a ton of beef using improved pasture are vastly less in terms of the climate, as well as in terms of land. So instead of a trade-off, we have a win-win here, which we can work with. This is a similar result for UK dairy. This is how much soil gets lost per ton of milk versus its yield. And you can see 3 conventional systems down here with low land costs, also wasting less soil per ton of milk than these are 2 organic ones up here. Before we did this work, I used to think organic food was good for the planet and good for me. I don't now. I actively avoid organic food because of this kind of reason. It performs badly on everything we could assess it. Of course, you do get trade-offs. This is not an infinitely, there are some different things to navigate. This is some new work just out by a PhD student of mine who's working on pigs. She's looked at thousands of pig farms, hundreds of pig farms, both in the UK and in Brazil, actually. And this is looking at an index of welfare against this land cost. And what she finds is that these more efficient more land efficient systems do tend to have poorer welfare, they tend to have a higher welfare cost. But even in this case, Harriet found some systems which sit down here, which have low land cost and good welfare. So to me, the trick is finding out where you really do have trade-offs, and where you do have trade-offs, then see if there's any systems which buck that pattern, which are different, and then working out what makes those work and try to scale up from those. So the last point was this caveat: you've got productive farming, it's doing very well, it's producing a lot of food. How do you stop it from expanding everywhere? To some extent, economics will help. There are market effects here. So on the average, if you produce more food, the price will come down, so the incentive to expand is reduced a little bit. And if you look across the world, on the average, sparing does happen when yields go up. But it happens to a variable degree. It depends on the commodity, it depends on the markets, it depends on whether the technology that's enabling you to boost your yield uses up labor or frees up labor, lots of different things. So it's inefficient because of a rebound effect that we need to worry about. And so we think it's clear that as well as boosting yields, you're going to have to do more. You're going to have to find some way of coupling whatever it is that's helping you have higher yields with some other incentives or regulations to freeze the footprint of farming, to not expand it, in some cases even to shrink it. We've thought, what could those be, and come up with a list, this is work led by Ben, 4 things that might work to do that. One is certification. Remember, if you go and buy a certified coffee that's said to be bird friendly, it will come from a shared landscape like that. It will have shade coffee with a few rainforest trees above it. I want to buy coffee from this landscape. Sun coffee, where the farmers are guaranteed, as well as producing their coffee efficiently, that they're freezing their footprint and they're not expanding into the neighboring forest. So certification might help. There's some work on that now going on in Costa Rica, a different type of certification. Land use zoning might be important, so where farmers are prevented from expanding into a particular, beyond a certain footprint by land use zoning. This is the agricultural area, this is the area for nature. If they can't go beyond that, then they become innovative. Long-standing observation been confirmed in work here in Brazil, where farmers are restricted by where they can expand. Their yields will go up because land suddenly becomes a scarce input when it normally isn't. Some parts of the world, like where I come from, farmers' decisions are guided largely by subsidies. We can change subsidy regimes so that farmers are encouraged both to farm efficiently and collectively maybe to set aside land for nature. So you can change things around that way. And last, if what farmers need to boost their yields is something that needs to be deployed strategically in a large area, maybe by government, that might be a new road or an irrigation scheme or extension offices, then those can be deployed strategically so that they're delivered preferentially in places which are already cleared but have a yield gap. And they're not deployed to the frontier. You don't build your roads there. You don't send your extension officers to do that. And it's a nice example of that happening in India. So the conclusion from this, and maybe from the whole thing, is then that I think high yield farming is going to be key to slowing biodiversity loss, to bending the curve on nature's loss. We're going to have to do those other things as well. We have to do work on diets, we have to do work on waste, but we have to do work on yields. And to do that, I think it changes what as conservationists we think of as the roles of different people in this. Where I come from in the UK, there's a tendency amongst conservationists to see productive farmers as the problem. And to me, they're absolutely the source of the solution. And we need to renegotiate that relationship so that we're working with them to work out the least bad ways of them doing what they do very well, which is keep us well fed, at the same time as having innovative ideas about how to limit the negative impacts of those things. That's all what I was going to say. And there's just a summary of those points. Thank you very much.
We're going to open for questions here, and afterwards we're going to open for questions that we receive online.
I have one. Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. We are very happy to have you here, and I think you speak for all of us that we're very happy to have you, and that you gave such a robust analysis of different approaches to solve the food problem that we're going to undoubtedly face in the near future. But you were presenting different strategies, tackling different kinds of perspectives on the problem, and always speaking on a global perspective. But throughout the presentation, I was thinking that some strategies apply more in some different parts of the globe. So how does it, for example, biodiversity is mostly concentrated in the tropics, and food production and food intensity, food demands also in the tropics, and we are going to have increasing the demand for land for production and also increasing the demand for land for sparing.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that conflicts around environmental injustice, maybe because traditionally these countries are the most poor ones, and then urbanization is there, and they want to improve their livelihoods.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this kind of conflict, like this environmental justice, or rather environmental injustice, may be an obstacle or maybe an opportunity in this scenario? I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And there's people here that know much more about environmental justice than I do, I confess. But it is something that we concern ourselves with. And I think, I don't have a simple answer, but I think all places are different at one level. So one size, in terms of this type of farming or that type of farming, governance arrangement won't suit everywhere, won't fit everywhere. But I think I go back to the point that if we don't globally increase yields, all bets are off. Well, we know habitat left in Africa. I mean, that's it, finished. And the consequences for that. And so on in different parts of the world. So that's the so how do we get to that? And then I think then we need to be imaginative and creative and think about different solutions that work as far as with the grain of societies in different places. So, for example, some of this is going to be more efficiently done by industrial scale producers. They know how to do these things. The injustices, there may not be injustices in that case. It may be, Ben spent a long time working in Ghana, talking with small scale producers. And so he was working with small scale producers, also worked on oil palm plantations, looked at their yield. And he asked the local farmers, what do you want? Because of course no one asks the local farmers what they want. So what do you want? And they said, well, actually, I want to sell my land to the oil palm plantation. We said, well, this is your sovereignty. This is your land. This has been your land for centuries. This is your land. They said, well, every time there's a drought, or there's a problem with getting my goods to market, or there's a glut of product, or whatever, or there's a pest, I can't get my kids medicine. I want to work in a place which has a steady income, with a school and some lights. So they were very clear that even in a smallholder context, they didn't want to stay smallholders. I was very struck by that. I was surprised. So I think there's a thing there. We have to not be romantic about what being small. On the other hand, I think there are some interventions which can help farmers boost their yields and work very much with smallholder production. That thing in Kenya I was telling you about with the maize is extraordinary. So they've got as I said, the maize yields roughly are doubled as a consequence of that action. This is where, and it's working with smallholders with their own land. They are then able to do extraordinary things. So they can then buy a cow. And a dairy cow in Kenya is an insurance policy. So they're able to buy a cow. Rural to urban migration, where this project's been working, has been reversed. So people are coming back from the cities. The consequence of that is crime rates are down and HIV rates are down as well. So that's working with the grain. So I think that's a simplistic answer, really. There's a lot more detail. But I think I think we have to look at all options and then they have to fit a set of criteria, making something socially equitable. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yes, a question. Well, thank you for the talk. I guess the title was perfect. It's very uncomfortable. It's a punch in the stomach. But it's very nice. The data seems very clear. It's very, very interesting. But somehow I feel that was a little bit dangerous maybe here in Brazil because we still have a lot of land problems. How to spare the land between the big producers that are even in Brazil and the small producers are here in the country. Well, it's not exactly a question, but it's more like, I haven't bought exactly the idea how to solve this problem. This is a big problem, and I'm convinced about the biodiversity problem. Maybe you are also convinced about the carbon problem, but I'm not sure if I'm convinced about the human problem that comes together with this idea. And that's maybe my major point, and also the economic problem. We know that if there's some incentives of improving the yields, probably more people will go and start to decrease the land.
Yes.
Well, that's the point. Maybe it's for the future. 20 years studying biodiversity, maybe in the next years thinking about other problems.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you say, and I'm worried too. I don't like the answer. It's not the answer we thought we would get. Reese, my colleague in this, He spent 30 years creating land sharing as an initiative in Europe. He devised the agri-environment measures that the rest of Europe uses. And he certainly doesn't make his life comfortable either. So of course there will be bad actors, and there will be, politically, bad politicians who want to do the wrong thing. And we have to worry about that. My hope, maybe it's a naive one though, is that there are good actors, there are people who want to, including politicians, who want things to be better, not worse. In many sectors, and I can't speak to the Brazilian agriculture sector, but in many sectors, many of the producers, I think, that have traditionally behaved sometimes very badly, are changing, and they have to change. And not only that, there are fewer and fewer of them. So there's an exciting initiative which is led by a Norwegian colleague, a Swedish colleague, in Stockholm. They've identified this thing called keystone actors. So they worked out that almost every sector in the world is dominated by about 15 boardrooms. Doesn't matter what resource sectors this is. So all fisheries are controlled, the world's fisheries are controlled by, the legal ones, are controlled by 10 boardrooms. Mostly Japanese and Norwegian, there was a Chilean. Anyway, they've worked and found those people, and they get them together once a year. And they're changing how they fish. And they're not telling the world, because that would be bad for their share price, but they are telling each other a little bit. And things are beginning to move, because they know, Trump doesn't, he's got a 4-year horizon, same presumably here. These guys want to be in business doing fish, because that's what they know how to do, in 50 years. So they have a vastly bigger, and they're global, right? So it's not as though they can shift problems somewhere else. And those are beginning to move. And I'm quite encouraged by that. And you see it a little, I see it a little bit with some of the agri, and there's lots of bad agri in Europe as well. But some of those, I think, have a longer time perspective and a broader mind than we might think, and certainly than our governments might think. And then, to me, the trick is, well, if I go in, and I'm really glad there's Greenpeace out there, if I go in saying, I'm opposed to GM, there's no way I can have a conversation. But if I'm saying, actually, this could be an answer, we just have to do it in a smart and open way, then I can have a conversation with those people. So I share your concern, but I don't think it's insurmountable. And I also don't think we have a choice. My heart, as an ecologist, I worked for a long time in Africa, and I look at that and I think, crikey, and it's not 20 years' time. We wait another 20 years, that'll be gone. It's now. Anyway, very good.
No, sure. That's great answer. Perfect. Thank you.
I have a question about the winners and losers that you're showing. Basically, what I'm thinking is when you're looking at specific species, and because I was kind of curious on how you should did it. But it's like, do you look at a specific crop of land or space? And then you look at all the species that are there, and you look at the abundances in different fetches.
Yeah.
But then, how do you look at indirect effects, like if the stream gets some poisoning, like pesticides and stuff like that? Did you guys consider that kind of thing? Because I'm thinking that might be specifically in Brazil also. That would be very tricky to look only locally, and when you think about secondary problems that happen.
That's a very good point. So we worry about that. We don't do much directly on pesticides. We used to do some stuff on that. But the survey protocol we take is we go to a region and we try and find a region that's topographically, climatically, in terms of soil, pretty consistent. So we haven't got confounding effects. And then we look for 25 1 kilometre square, so they're quite big. They've got to have been under a given land use for at least a couple of decades, so we're not looking at legacy effects or things that haven't yet played out. Yields have got to be the same in that place for a long time, so we concern ourselves with sustainability of yield, at least over that time frame. And then we count everything that's in that 1 kilometre square, 25 times over, go back and do it again and again and again until we've got a reasonable estimate. And factored into that, there are some of these edge effects. They're not all there. Some of these spillover effects. So if the natural habitat, so we don't go into the middle of a really isolated block of forest. We go into a block that would be typical of what you might get if you spared land. So we did this in Poland. We could have gone to the forest that's been there for 1,000 years. Then we went to a small block that's been there since the First World War, looked at that. And then if there is some spillover, some harmful effect coming in from neighbouring farmland, it would be manifest in that area. So it's included in this. This isn't perfect, pristine habitat. And so on. There's still more that we could do. We could look at really long distance effects. We could look at effects of eutrophication. There are so many other things we could do. It's difficult enough just counting every tree. To be honest.
I'm a lot of
That's a good question. Yeah.
I would just get the data that is ready and just
Yeah. But there are important things we haven't done yet.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, we have three interesting questions online. I need to put it for the audio.
Yes.
Okay, so the first question is from Mr. Carlos Alberto Scaramuza. The productivity-oriented message from your lecture could be very welcomed by the agribusiness sector here in Brazil. Is there any effort to dialogue with them around your comfortable observations?
With the agri-sector in Brazil?
Yes.
Not by me. I know that the Brazilian student we had who did quite a lot of that work in the Pampas, she talked quite a lot with people who were doing planning there. In other ways, I talked to Agar and Bernardo. But I'm very happy to talk to anybody, for sure. And interestingly, in some of the places we've worked, we have better engagement with government and with agriculture and with conservation than we do in the UK. We do. But I think that's because other countries are often more open. And maybe as an outsider you get, in some bizarre way, easier access to people as well. But I have had more conversations with the government in China than with the government in the UK about this. Well, I would love to, if there was, yeah. Thank you for the question.
Another question is from Skyped. Dr. Balmford, you show some interesting and alarming projections for Africa. The Brazilian Cerrado is another example of high-impact farming. How can we improve conservation in savannas?
Good question. I think the same overarching answer. So whatever Brazil, for other reasons, is going to decide it produce that efficiently. Do it in a way that, everyone here knows this much better than me. There are places in the Sahara where you will do much more damage, places where you will do less damage. But do that in a way you hope that enables you also to push hard for conservation. I think Bernardo's 2014 paper about the size of yield gaps in Brazil is one of the things that gives me great hope. That if land was seen as a valuable input, a scarce factor of production rather than one of the cheapest ones, then people would use land much more efficiently, and there's enormous scope for that, particularly in cattle ranching, but in other things too. Colleagues of mine who people have been getting in touch saying, do you know the size of the gap in soy? What? There's a gap? No, there is. And they sent papers talking about gaps in soy. Oil palm. I thought oil palm was fantastically efficient. Most oil palm in Indonesia and Malaysia, when you see those kind of factories of oil, of palm, they're running at about 70% of what they could because they don't look after them properly. In that case, the costly input to production is training. And so, Indonesia and Malaysia hugely expanded their oil palm industries and they forgot about agronomy. How well the mill works is you can get twice as much oil out of than they're getting on the average at the moment, just by running the mill more efficiently. We're crazy, so we're wasting so much, but because land is the thing that we don't, so many times it's the free thing or the nearly free thing. You just steal it or pay someone a small amount. It's the thing you don't think about, but it's the thing that constrains everything else that humanity will have to deal with.
One more question from Andrew David Gonzalez. Increase yield through farming practices, agroecological practices such as silvopastoralism, always on increasing diversity in the cropland. How is different from wildlife-friendly farming?
So there isn't a hard line here, but in Europe, for example, wildlife-friendly farming involves doing things at small. We start with a relatively efficient conventional system, typically, and it will involve changing that so that you can tolerate more wildlife around. So you're putting in a margin around the field where you've got insects. It will be reinstating hedgerows. It will be reducing uses of fertilizers and pesticides. And a few of those things you can do without affecting yields, but nearly always you affect yields. And in the case of silvopastoralism, you've been increasing yields. As you move from the left to the right, you're increasing yields because you may be doing some improvements to the pasture, you're putting in shade, you're putting in extra forage, you're reducing, therefore, you're improving animal health, nutritionally and in terms of shade and so on. You can carry on down beyond that. You want extreme sparing in those systems, then you go to feedlots. Now, in terms of their environmental impacts, in greenhouse gases and in land use, and in biodiversity terms, everything I've seen feedlots are great. They've got other problems. And I'm not saying I would endorse feedlots for other reasons, but if I don't want feedlots, maybe I just shouldn't do beef. In terms of meeting the needs of 11 billion beefeaters, we should be going for feedlots. So that's a very controversial note to end on.
Any more questions from you?
I just have one comment. You said in the beginning that spatial planning, it's something that it has an impact, but not that high impact. But on the other hand, your solution, I guess, pushes to spatial planning somehow. If you have big areas, because now you have, as you have natural areas or high yield productive areas, then it's more than ever to be important to set up each area should maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. So I think that analysis, which was David Williams' paper, that was looking at spatial planning just by itself.
Yeah,
without doing anything, saying that it's got to, so that you change the practice in this zone versus this zone, which is what we'll get to at the end. But by itself, it's not enough. There's something like that. No, absolutely, this is then about spatial planning. And there's a really interesting conversation, a series of conversations around the grain size that you're talking about. So, we're typically thinking of areas under natural habitat in our analyses, and when we model them, which might be 1,000 hectares, they might be 10,000 hectares, maybe in the Amazon they might be bigger still, but they're that kind of size range. They're not 1 hectare or below, that's more like sharing. But there's an interesting question that some people then come up with, particularly in Europe actually, which is, well, why don't we then just produce all the food the world needs? And we'll feed Africa, which is, in my head, that's a total disaster for a whole load of reasons. But you can go to that extreme and go far too far. And then, obviously, that's a disaster economically as well as ecologically.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
So you're going to stay in Brazil until May?
Early May, yeah.
Early May, so it's supposed to catch up.
Very, very happy to chat with anybody. Yeah.
And you're going to leave your email for people online?
Yes, it's on the first line of the yes. I can type it in.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And if anyone has a government or agribusiness, as long as I don't mind talking in English. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
think the following. Yes, yes.